The end of talks in Saudi Arabia aimed at bringing about a ceasefire in the war between Russia and Ukraine is being seen with a sense of optimism. There is a proposal for a 30-day ceasefire as a starting step. Ukraine says that they are willing to go along with that. We aren't entirely sure about what Russia may or may not do, whether they agree with it at all. All in all, it does appear that the first steps of the process towards the end of a war which has lasted more than 3 years between Russia and Ukraine are clearly underway. Joining us now to give us his views on what is taking place, Ian Bremmer. Thanks very much, Mr. Bremmer, for being with us.
Sure.
In terms of the viability of a potential ceasefire, Ukraine has agreed to this USA proposed 30-day ceasefire contingent on Russia's reciprocity. That's been outlined in the joint US-Ukraine statement. But with Russia holding a fifth of Ukraine's territory and so far showing no signs of retreat, do you see Moscow agreeing to this pause, or could it be a non-starter without, for example, territorial concessions?
Well, there's not much required for the deal, right? I mean, it's a 30-day deal and it doesn't resolve anything. All it really does is provide some space for negotiations, which the Americans would like to get started. There were no conditions required for the Ukrainians to come to that agreement. In fact, there were concessions from the Americans. They restarted intelligence cooperation, which of course they had been doing for years, but they don't have to do it. And they restarted the military aid, which had been suspended under Trump. So essentially, the Ukrainians got a couple of goodies for signing. The questions will be, do the Russians get any goodies for signing, right? And as of right now, the answer appears to be no, but let's see. It's certainly plausible that the Americans might say, well, we're willing to reduce some of the sanctions that are bilaterally placed against Russia. You could imagine them saying that they would reduce some of the freezing of assets of some of the oligarchs that are close to Putin. Putin is not going to want to accept this deal in and of itself. He's going to want to make it bigger, broader. He's going to want to involve a broader American rapprochement. And the question will be, how much of that is Trump personally willing to offer when he gets on the phone individually and directly with Vladimir Putin, which I expect will happen in relatively short order. That's the open question here. Yeah. But could you get to a 30-day agreement with a couple of relatively modest American carrots for the Russians? I think you probably can.
Now, the US resuming military aid in the interim period, also intelligence sharing after the Jeddah talks, marks, a significant reversal from Trump's earlier suspension. Comes at a time just in the last couple of days when the Ukrainians have taken a lot of hits, particularly in the Kursk region. Does this signal perhaps a genuine recommitment to Ukraine's defense, or is it essentially a tactical move to pressure Russia into negotiations while keeping Kiev on a short leash?
Well, first of all, it's not clear that the Ukrainians have gotten routed in Kursk, or they've recognized, given the push from the United States and the likelihood of needing to accept a ceasefire, holding on to a piece of territory in Russia was clearly going to make that ceasefire much, much harder to get to. So if it turns out that the Ukrainians actually essentially told their soldiers, stand down, we're done with Kursk for now, that makes it easier to get these 30 days in place. But there's no question that the Ukrainians know that they cannot maintain this fight for as long as the Russians can. And they certainly can't, given the pressure from the United States right now. So I think that Trump made that very obvious to Zelensky. He did it in a way that was particularly problematic for the Ukrainians and for the Europeans, in the sense that the Americans are much less trusted. Their commitments are much less trusted now. But certainly the credibility of Trump willing to throw the Ukrainians under the bus, that is now very high. And that was clearly his top priority insofar as Trump's interest here is to end the war.
What happens to Zelensky, assuming that this process goes through?
Well, he's in slightly better position. I mean, the fact is the Ukrainian population rallied around him when Trump referred to him as a dictator, when Trump said he needs to have elections as soon as a ceasefire is in place. Now, again, that 30-day ceasefire he's agreed to specifically does not say that he's prepared to have elections over the course of that period of time. And the Ukrainian opposition is not asking him to. So he has a rally around the flag effect in Ukraine, much as we've seen around the Liberal Party in Canada, much as we've seen around the Claudia Sheinbaum in Mexico, because a reaction to the Americans hitting them so hard. But longer term, is Zelensky going to be able to stay in power as we talk about the concessions that Ukraine will need to accept to bring this to peace, which is functionally a partition of their country, which means not becoming a part of NATO, even though that membership had symbolically, at least nominally, been offered to them by the Americans and the NATO alliance. I think these are incredibly hard pills for Zelensky, a democratically elected president, to swallow. And so, I mean, looking out 12, 18 months, it's harder to imagine that Zelensky will be in charge.
Now, Ukraine insists that Europe be involved in the peace process, but the Jeddah talks sidelined European powers, given the sense that Russia cannot win this geopolitically. Could this exclusion fracture Western unity and perhaps embolden Putin to dictate terms?
It certainly could. Now, I mean, the Europeans are another group that is becoming more unified by Trump. This is, of course, one of the great ironies of Trump, is that he's not unifying the United States. The U.S. is only more divided under his presidency, but he's unifying a lot of other places against the United States around the world. And certainly the Europeans are now willing to do a lot more, willing to spend militarily on themselves and on Ukraine in ways that they were not prepared to under Biden. And in principle, Trump should be able to say, look, that's a win for me. I finally got them to do that. But of course, the reason they're doing it is because they feel the need to be independent from the United States. They think that they are facing an adversary in the American president, the vice president, in Elon Musk, that they never faced from a previous American administration. And so here, I do think that if the Europeans are capable of standing up much greater military support, if they're the ones that are going to put 30,000 or more troops on the ground in Ukraine after a ceasefire, if they're the ones that are ensuring that Ukraine has the money to engage in reconstruction, then it's not just do they get a seat at the table, they have a seat at the table. They are functionally the ones that are ensuring that there is a level of long-term stability on the ground in Ukraine. The Americans are not providing that backstop. That's analogous to what we see playing out in the Middle East right now, where Trump, of course, a few weeks ago sat down and said, I'm going to take Gaza and the Palestinians are going to leave and I'm going to make it into a Riviera on the Mediterranean. But of course, that's not what's happening. What's happening is that a number of Arab countries are putting together a plan to spend more money, take the lead politically, engage in terms of security, and that means they are the ones that will ultimately determine the terms for a long-term deal. So the 30-day ceasefire, if it gets done, driven by the Americans with the Russians and the Ukrainians, if we get a sustainable peace, it will be because the Europeans are doing the most and because they're taking a leadership role.
But frankly, beyond talk, is there anything militarily the Europeans could actually have done? Boots on the ground would be extremely problematic for the Russians, firstly. And secondly, in terms of the industrial capacity of countries, including France, the United Kingdom and Germany, just to sustain the war effort of Ukraine, indefinitely going forward, seems to have been impossible. That's why we are in this situation, right?
It's not been impossible. They've been unwilling to do it. Why? Because the Americans have been more than happy to shoulder it over the course of the Biden administration. Now that that is no longer the case, you're essentially asking the question of the Europeans. And just in the last 2 weeks, the Germans, for example, have put forward a piece of legislation that would extend, basically would negate the debt brake, which requires a constitutional majority that they will get before the new government comes in. And it means that there's no longer any cap on defense spending. And it would also add some 500 billion for infrastructure spending. This was inconceivable from the Germans even 3 weeks ago. And we see similar moves being taken by the French, for example, by the Polish government, for example. Now, I agree that none of that is going to make the Europeans the equivalent of American military might in 5 years. But remember what they say about the camper. You don't need to outrun the bear. You just need to outrun the other campers. And so for the Europeans, you don't need to create a military that is competitive with the United States. You just need to help the Ukrainians defend themselves against Russia. And of course, the Russian economy is far, far smaller than the European economy. They've lost massive amounts of human capital. They've experienced 800,000+ casualties in 3 years in fighting this war. All the Europeans need to do is help the Ukrainians to defend themselves against a much smaller Russia, bigger than Ukraine, but smaller than Europe. And there, if the Europeans are willing to truly take steps that they have heretofore been unwilling to, but capable of, then we're in a very different dynamic. And it's important that your viewers know that.
Isn't it bizarre that, we are having this conversation based on what's taken place in Saudi Arabia, and yet issues like territory, which is the central issue here, or security guarantees, which Zelensky rightfully wants, we haven't come around to that at all. It's just a ceasefire with nothing beyond that, an assumption that that might actually happen, a security guarantee. There is no guarantee, right? Russia can restart whatever it chooses to in the future. At the moment, no security guarantee.
Sure, that's right. Very similar to Gaza. Again, there were no hard guarantees for what Palestinian governance was going to look like, but you did manage to get a ceasefire that created some space, in this case, for some of the hostages to be released, for some of the prisoners, Palestinian prisoners, to be released, also for humanitarian aid to get in. You could have easily asked me, but we haven't resolved a two-state solution for the Palestinians. We haven't resolved what governance is going to look like for Gaza. That's right. And here, we haven't in any way, even if the ceasefire comes into place, we have not resolved any of the ongoing issues about how Ukraine is going to be ensured that has security as a sovereign state. And let's face it, nobody thinks they're going to get their territory back. Now, that's wrong. It was illegally invaded by the Russians. They have a principle of territorial integrity enshrined in the United Nations Charter that the world has in principle supported for generations now, since 1945, and yet the Americans just a few weeks ago, with a General Assembly resolution, decided that they were going to support a piece of a declaration that no longer called for territorial integrity, just called for ending the war. And territorial integrity is not a part of it, which is why the countries that supported the U.S. were North Korea and Sudan and Syria and Belarus and Russia. Not exactly the exemplars of international leadership on the global stage.
So Ian, this is my conclusion, and having covered the war 3 times on the ground and anchoring all of this, at the end of the day, Ukraine will likely remain a country. There has been no regime change. There will be no regime change. And they have to accept that at least 20% of their territory is gone. For Russia, it means that they would have gained approximately 20% of Ukrainian territory. However, they are substantially weakened. Their military will take at least a decade, in my assumption, to get back the same number of tanks, the same number of missiles, and more importantly, the same number of soldiers, perhaps more than a decade. So in a sense, it's lose-lose for both sides, right?
I've always thought that this was lose-lose for both sides. Putin is not under pressure domestically because he doesn't face democratic elections. He's a dictator. So he, in a sense, looks at it a little differently. But, even from a pure power perspective, he takes 20% of Ukraine that is going to take billions of dollars and decades to rebuild. He has the remainder of Ukraine that will be armed to the teeth and filled with hatred for his country. So that's a worse security situation than he had before 2014, when he illegally annexed Crimea and sent his green men into the Donbass. And then you have NATO, which will have Europe spending a lot more on their defense, and an expanded NATO, including Finland and Sweden, which means that NATO has encroached substantially on Russia's own borders. Now, all of that looks like a huge loss. If Putin is able to cut a deal directly with Trump over the heads of Europe, and as a consequence, NATO starts to erode and fragment, and the transatlantic relationship is not what it was, that looks like a big strategic win for Putin. And certainly before the Riyadh meeting, when we had the conversations between Putin and Trump, and then we had the Russians meeting with the Americans in Saudi Arabia, things were looking a lot better for Putin on that front. And I think that's the big open question that remains unaddressed from the way you just framed this to me.
Ian Bremmer, wonderful speaking to you as always. Thank you very much for sharing your thoughts. Thank you very much indeed.
My pleasure. Yep.